Dobro utro. Unfortunately, I have to speak in English. I hope you excuse me that my Russian is very, very limited. But good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming, especially at this early hour on Sunday. What I want to talk today about is the topic One minute? Okay. Okay, it's not working yet. Okay. We'll wait. Okay. So what I want to talk today about is a topic that we call genetic history. So we do reconstruct the history of human populations using DNA to tell us something about migration, for example, so how humans moved in the past, but also about adaptation, so how humans adopted a certain lifestyle or genetically changed to certain parts of the world when they migrated into, for example, a new region of the world. So myself, I'm a professor at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, which is an institute that was only founded a few years ago. So the institute only exists since 3-4 years. And we have 3 different topics that people in my institute are working on. That is archaeology, linguistics and cultural evolution, as well as what I do, archaeogenetics. Okay. Should I continue or? I should come there? Somebody else is giving my lecture. It's almost a familiar story to me. I think last time I was here, the presentation didn't work at all. At least we have slides today, so. Okay, good. So we have those 3 different topics, and the type of questions that we can address with these topics result often in something that we call big data. Because what we combine here in our institute is science, especially the natural sciences, with questions that come out of human history. So we, for example, use genomics, proteomics, isotopes, databases to address classical questions that people have been asking in the humanities. And what we basically generate is what we call big data from the past. So we can then, for example, answer questions about the history of populations. This is what I will mostly talk today about, using, for example, genomics or isotopes. We can ask how humans impacted the environment. So how the climate changed, but also what was the impact of the human population on the environment, using, for example, sediment cores or ice cores. We can also see how humans modified ecosystems. So by, for example, using genomics or radiocarbon dating. We can look at how languages spread in the world with large databases. So I speak an Indo-European language. Most of you speak an Indo-European language. What's the common ancestor of those languages? And when did these different languages disperse in the world and how they're related to each other? We can also look at the coevolution, how genes and culture influence each other. So for example, when people adopted agriculture and started to drink a lot of milk, our body had to get used to it, and we had to genetically shift and change to actually adapt to this new cultural practices. And this is something that we have pioneered some years ago, we also look at ancient microbes and the genomes of ancient microbes to learn something about the evolution of pathogens and microbes that live together with humans, that can cause infectious diseases, but also that are part of our body. Like, for example, the microbes that live in your gut, or that live in your mouth, or that live in your nose, or on your skin, and how they change through time. So how do we do that? So what we do is what we call archaeogenetics. So it's a combination of archaeology, and genetics. So what we take as a material to extract genetic information from is often ancient bones that we get from collections, like Alexandra, for example, here, who introduced me so kindly. She has, for example, provided us with bones from the past that we then use to extract DNA from. So this is a bone here. It's actually the bone of the Neanderthal type specimen, the right upper arm of the Neanderthal that was discovered 150 years ago, where then some years ago I drilled in a little hole to get powder, and then from this bone powder I can release the DNA that is still present in those ancient bones, even after thousands and thousands of years. And this DNA then we can decode, so we can basically reconstruct the sequence of the DNA, of those 4 different bases, A, C, T, G, even after thousands of years, using those kind of machines here. And those machines are called sequencing machines, so they can read the DNA. And those machines have improved a lot over the last few decades. So if you look, for example, back 10 years ago, the best machine that was available 10 years ago could only produce a few hundred DNA sequences per day. And now this machine here can produce 20 billion DNA sequences per day. So the throughput of those machines has increased by orders of magnitude. And that means, of course, it has become much cheaper. So if you look at the costs per genome, so how much did a genome cost? 15 years ago or so, a genome cost $100 million. Then about 10 years ago or so, it was still $10 million per genome. But if we look back, today we are at $1,000 or so. So it's much, much cheaper now. And it's so cheap that there are even companies where you can have your DNA analyzed for $100. So there's a company in the US where you can send your saliva and they sequence your genome. But they do genome-wide analysis, and that only costs about $70 to $100. That's very, very cheap. So I, for example, gave that to my parents for Christmas last year. So maybe if you look for an idea, Christmas is soon, maybe you want to have a genome sequence for Christmas present. And that has also caused that we have been able to study the genomes of thousands of people from all over the world over the last few years. So this is the data set that we are currently using in our lab. So what you see here are green dots, and each green dot represents a population from today in the world, where we have genetic data. And you can see that we have people from almost all over the world, especially a high number of people from India, but also from the former Soviet Union. We have a large number of more than 1,000 different individuals from different human populations that we have been studying genome-wide. There was a lot of work that we did together with Oleg Balanovsky. But we also have, and this is the purple dots here, it might be a bit hard to see, all those purple dots are actually presenting genomes from people from the past, so from ancient skeletons. You can also see that we have many, many, many from Western Eurasia, also from Central Asia. We don't have so many from Africa, South America, North America, but people are working on it, that we also get genetic data from other parts of the world. So what can we then do with that type of information? How do those genomes that we have from people from the past and from the present tell us something about the history of those people? And one thing you can do is you can take those genomes, so the DNA code of those people, and compare how similar or how different people are. So if I take the DNA of any of you here in the room and compare it to my own DNA, we are about 99.9% similar. So almost 100%. But there is 0.1% differences. And those differences we can quantify and look at. And one possibility to look at the genetic differences between people is something that we call a principal component analysis. So basically you take this large data set, which is the genome, which has of course billions of positions and millions of differences, and you can plot in 2 dimensions, so 1 dimension and the other dimension, the genetic distance between people. And this is something that this group around John November did about 10 years ago in a publication where they took genome-wide data of people from Europe. And they then compared the genetic distance of those people. So what you see here are different dots, and each dot is a person. And if there's another dot which is close by, this is a very close relative of that person. Or it's not a close relative, it's not kinship, but it's somebody who is genetically quite similar. Whereas if it's somebody who is here and somebody who is there, they're genetically quite distant. Yeah? So the closer you are on this plot, the more similar you are genetically. And after they took 3,000 people's DNA, they then colored each dot by where the grandparents of this person were coming from. And then they said everybody who had his grandparents from Portugal got purple. Everybody who had his grandparents from Spain got blue. Everybody who had his grandparents from Italy got brown. France got yellow. Switzerland got kind of this other type of purple here. Red, Ireland, United Kingdom, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Austria, Germany, Bulgaria, other countries in Eastern Europe. Sorry, I can't read it from here. So what you actually reconstruct, based on just genetic data, is the map of Europe, right? And that makes sense because somebody who lives in your neighborhood, you have a higher chance to have children with than somebody who lives far away. So the closer somebody lives to you, the higher the chance you have babies with that person, and therefore also to be genetically more similar. So genetic data, so your genomes that you carry in you, carry the information where you come from, right? That's very important. And you can also use genetic data to reconstruct basically maps, like almost topography, which is very interesting. And this was 10 years ago, and back then we did not understand the process how this genetic structure that we see in Europe today has formed through time. How old is that? Is that 50,000 years old since the first people came to Europe? Is it 10,000 years old? Is it 1,000 years old? We had no idea. And this is what we are trying now in our institute, and there's also many other people in the world that are trying that, to reconstruct the genetic structure of Europe and other parts of the world through time, right? So we take time slices and then we look, how does it look today compared to the past and previous time periods. And you can look at many different time periods and compare them to each other and see if there were genetic changes, if something shifted. If there was, for example, a major shift in the genetic structure, it might indicate that there was a migration and people were coming from somewhere else to this new place. So if we look through human history, we have many different time periods that I think many of them are familiar to you. You might have heard about the Paleolithic or the Neolithic or the Bronze Age, that in different parts of the world, and this is now the chronology for Central Europe, happened at different time periods. So there were cultural shifts, so the material culture changed, and therefore also those kind of new ages started. So when people started to have bronze, then we call it the Bronze Age. And when people start to have iron, we call it the Iron Age. And there's different time periods where this might have happened. And much of this human history is before we have historical documents. So it's prehistory. It's actually not history. And if it's in prehistory, we have no information about what happened to the people. The only information we have is archaeology, anthropology, but we don't really know much about major events. We don't know about wars. We don't know about people moving. We don't know anything about a major migration. People decided to go this way or that way. We have no information. And archaeology and anthropology are very important disciplines to tell us something about what happened. But often it's not so easy to, for example, know if we see a change in the archaeology, is that also change in the people, right? And one of the biggest questions that people have trying to address in archaeology for many, many years was a big event that happened in prehistory that we call the Neolithic Revolution. It's a major event. It's the change from Mesolithic foraging lifestyle, so from hunting and gathering, to farming. So today, all of us are actually farmers culturally, right? I mean, probably none of you, maybe not so many of you, work on the farm today. Otherwise, probably you would be here in the lecture hall. but maybe you come from a farm, or you have families that come from a farm. But back just a few hundred years ago, most of us had a farming lifestyle, right? But this is quite a new episode in human history. It's only about 7,000 years that most people in the world are farmers. Before 7,000 years ago, most people in the world, or almost everybody, was a hunter-gatherer. And this transition was a big transition in lifestyle, right? Also enabled now to have 7 billion people on the planet, so it was a really, really big step in human history. And what archaeologists have been trying to ask and answer for many years now is, if this transition from hunting and gathering to farming was just a cultural transition, so was it just new ideas that were spreading? So was it just somebody saw, oh, my neighbors, they have a farm now, maybe I should stop my lifestyle as a hunter-gatherer and I should also build a farm, right? It's a good idea because you have food, you can store the food for over the winter, you don't need to go hunting, it's nice, it's cold outside, you can sit inside your fireplace. Maybe it's a nice idea to have a farm. Or was it actually people that were coming to all those places in the world and spreading agriculture? So was it actually just a group of people that were introducing the new technology, but it was not ideas that were just promoted? So this is the question, pots or people? Was it just culture that changed, or was it also the people? Was it the biology of the people that changed? And this is a question just based on archaeology is very difficult to answer. If you have just pottery, to know if this pottery was made by group A or group B, so by biologically different people, you don't know, because it was made by people. And they don't really leave any traces. You can only see the culture changes. So if it was really people that changed, it's really hard to answer. But genetics has the possibility to answer this question directly because we study the biology of the people. So if it was just culture that changed, if it was just the diffusion of ideas, what you would expect is that there is genetic continuity between the people that were hunter-gatherers, so the Mesolithic people, and then the people in the Neolithic that then have agriculture. They should be genetically the same. So there were ideas that were spreading, but the people are the same people. So the hunter-gatherers just have a new lifestyle, but they're the same people. Whereas if it was a diffusion of people, so if it was what we call endemic diffusion, so people actually moving with agriculture, what you would then expect is that there's genetic discontinuity and that there's a new population that brings agriculture to the region where there were the Mesolithic people before, and suddenly the people have changed. There's different people. Genetically, those people have changed, right? And that is something that genetics can tell us, but archaeology has a hard time to actually provide us with that type of information. So then, to address this question, what we have done some years ago, and which we continue to do in kind of high or large scale now, is to study the DNA of those ancient people. So we have studied the DNA of ancient foragers, so hunter-gatherers from Spain, from Central Europe, as well as from Scandinavia here. And we compared that DNA to the DNA of early farmers. Like, for example, this guy here, you might have seen his picture before. It's the so-called Iceman. He was found in the Alps some 30 years ago. And the genome of him was reconstructed some years ago. And we also looked at this lady here. So she was a 19 or 20-year-old lady that lived in the Stuttgart region about 7,000 years ago. And she had a lifestyle of early farming, which we know from archaeology. And we then compared the DNA of those people to the DNA of modern people from about 200 populations. So for many of them, you can see most of them are modern people, to see how they're related to each other. And then we again get one of those big clouds with all those dots. And each dot here represents a modern person. And what you see here is this colorful cloud that doesn't seem to mean so much if you look at it. But what you see here is, this is what we call the Near Eastern Cline. So this reaches from the Caucasus. So this is people from the Caucasus. This is people from Anatolia. This is people from the Near East, or from the Levant, so modern-day Jordan, Syria, and so forth. This is mostly Bedouins, so kind of North African population, or population that also live in the southern Levant. And this basically stretches from basically northern Africa, so modern-day Egypt, to the Caucasus. And here, these are all populations that come from Europe. But this is Iberia, France, Northern Europe, Central Europe. This would be many of you. This is Russia, actually. This is Russians here. This is the Baltics. And these are some populations in between, mostly from Southeastern Europe. So what we have here, again, is more or less geography. It's the map of Europe. It's just a different data set. This is what I showed you before, where it was only Europe, just a bit to the side. And this is now also including Anatolia, the Caucasus, the Near East, and Northern Africa. So if you want, this is the Mediterranean, and this is the Black Sea, right? So it more or less looks like geography again. But now we also have those ancient individuals in here, the DNA from those ancient skeletons. And if we compare them to the modern people, the first thing we see is that the hunter-gatherers don't look like people that live in Europe today. So there's no person in Europe today that genetically is very similar to an ancient hunter-gatherer. And that is actually different if we look at the early farmers. So those are the early farmers, and they're genetically quite similar to those green dots here. And those green dots are people that live today in Sardinia. And that was already discovered when the Iceman genome was first decoded, and they compared the Iceman to people that live in Europe today, and the Iceman looked like somebody from Sardinia. And then the newspaper said the Iceman was a tourist from Sardinia that got lost in the Alps, right? Which is stupid. That's not true. But what we now know is that every early farmer, and we have decoded more than 2,000 early farmers now, from Iberia, from Italy, from France, from Germany, from Great Britain, they all look like Sardinians. And that is not because all early farmers are from Sardinia. It's because people in Sardinia haven't changed for the last 7,000 years. So they are like a genetic island. They're like a genetic fossil. So if you ever want to meet the first farmers of Europe, you can go on vacation to Sardinia. Right? They still look like that. Like 7,000 years ago, all Europeans looked like that. But it's also very clear that the people that live in Europe today, in Central Europe, they're not just a mixture of hunter-gatherers and early farmers, right? We're not all here, but we're actually shifted in this direction. And there's another ancient population here, which we call the ancient North Eurasians, and they are best represented by genomes from the Baikal region. So this is Malta. It's actually a little boy that lived there 24,000 years ago. And this is Afontova Gora, which is an individual here from the Altai region. And they are kind of in this direction. You can see that the modern Europeans seem to be a genetic mixture of those three ancient populations. And this is also something that we tested in many other genetic tests that I don't have time to go into. But it seems that all Europeans today trace some of their ancestry back to those three different corners of basically the genetic past. And what we then try to find out in the second study that we just did a year later after the first study is, we were trying to find out when this population here came to Central Europe. Because the Iceman, for example, is 5,000 years old. Those guys are 7,000 years old. But by that time, we don't really have people that look like this, like modern Europeans. So when did basically this ancestry here come to Central Europe? And to address this question, we have collected many more ancient skeletons. This is from 2015. This was about 200 genomes. Like I said, now we have about 2,000. But that would be dots all over the map. There would be dots everywhere. So I tried to kind of reduce it a bit, and I only show you the data from 2015. So we have now skeletons from Central Europe, Iberia here, as well as from Russia. So this is the Samara region here, so on the Volga River, so downriver from here, and then also from the southern Russian steppes here. And now we have quite a lot of samples, so we can really look at genetic history through time. We can try to reconstruct the genetic relationships of people starting from the past to the present. Because you can see those samples span about 10,000 years of European history. So if we start our little time travel at 8,000 years ago, this is how Europe looks 8,000 years ago. In the background, you might see again our modern people. So they're just in gray here now. So this would be the Near East line. This is Europe. And this is Europe 8,000 years ago, or Western Eurasia, this region. You can see this is Western European hunter-gatherers, Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, Eastern European hunter-gatherers, so from this region here, and then the Samara region. So you have basically a cline, which is also reflected in geography, so west to east. Not a big surprise. Again, people that live closer to each other, they have a higher chance to have children with each other than with somebody who lives in the Samara region, right? So therefore, those guys end up here, and the other guys are up there. So this is 8,000 years ago in Western Eurasia, but at the same time, 8,000 years ago, you already have people in Europe that have agriculture. And they live in this region here, we call Anatolia. So this is how those guys look like. Those are early farmers. They already have farming at 8,000 years ago. And they're genetically quite distinct from the Europeans at that time, right? So there's quite a genetic distance between those people and those people. And now we move in time forward. So we move from 8,000 years ago to 7,500 years ago, to the first farmers of Europe. So the first people that had farming in Europe. How do they look genetically? Do they look like the hunter-gatherers? Or do they look like the Anatolian farmers, right? And if you look at them, this is how they look like. So those are then the people that lived in the same region like those people, but just 500 years later. And genetically, they're indistinguishable from the Anatolian early farmers. There's a few individuals that are genetically a bit distinct, but many of them look just almost identical to the people from Anatolia, which tells us that those people that live in Central Europe at 7,000 years ago came from here. They migrated. They brought agriculture. And there is no or very little genetic continuity between the hunter-gatherers and the early farmers, because this is people from basically Germany, and those are people from Germany just 500 years later. And genetically, they have completely shifted. It's a massive shift. We can also quantify how much genetic change was during that time. And if we do that, we find a 95% genetic shift. Just as a comparison, if we want to produce a similar shift from here to there, today in Europe, we would need 10 billion people migrating from Anatolia to Europe to produce the same signal. There is not even 10 billion people on the planet, right? But it was really a massive shift of people. So it was a major migration of people bringing agriculture from Anatolia to Central Europe, and also, of course, spreading it to other parts of the world. If we then move from 7,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago, we see that there is this slight change. You can see this is the people 5,000 years ago. This was the people 7,000 years ago. You see that there is a change. And the change happens in this direction here. And it changes in the direction of the hunter-gatherers, and indeed, in the DNA of the people at 5,000 years ago, like the Iceman, for example, we see suddenly bits and pieces that come from the hunter-gatherers. Because the hunter-gatherers, they're not extinct. They're still there. They live in parallel with the early farmers, and over time, they meet and have babies with each other. And when they have babies with each other, they're producing basically mixed people, right? Like what happens all over the world today. So it goes in this direction here. But it's also very clear that at 5,000 years ago, how people look in Europe today is not present yet, right? This is how we look like in Central Europe today. This is how Central Europe looked like 5,000 years ago. So when did this shift happen, right? So if we look at 5,000 years ago, and we look actually at this region here, the Samara region, it looks quite different. So the people that lived in the Samara region 5,000 years ago, they look like this. It's what we call the Bronze Age in this region already. So they already have bronze. So they're more advanced than the Neolithic farmers in Europe. And you see that they're genetically quite similar to the Neolithic people, which are hunter-gatherer people, and maybe also to the real hunter-gatherer people of Eastern Europe, but they're also shifted a bit, right? So there's a slight shift here in this direction here. But these people that live here are quite distinct from the people that live in Europe during that time. So this is Central Europe. This is the Samara region. So between here and there's a big genetic gap, right? So this is 5,000 years ago. If we now move from 5,000 years ago to 4,800 years ago, so just 200 years, we're just moving 200 years from 5,000 to 4,800 years ago, suddenly again something happens, and what happens looks like this. Suddenly they all come together. You have many cultures, like the Yamnaya culture, Shrubnaya culture, corded ware culture, Sintashta, bell beakers, all those people are suddenly genetic mixtures of those people here and of the people that lived in Europe before. And some of the people that we have in Central Europe, for example, the corded ware culture. The corded ware culture just comes after the Middle Neolithic. So this is the Middle Neolithic. This is Germany, for example, at 5,000 years ago, and this is Germany at 4,800 years ago. Those people, the corded ware culture, which is present all over Central Europe at the time, are almost indistinguishable again. They're extremely similar to the Bronze Age cultures that were living in this region here before, like the Yamnaya culture. So again, this is very strong evidence that we have a massive migration. We have actually a massive migration from this region here into Central Europe, and the same people also seem to move into the Altai region, so into the east. So we have an expansion of this population here into the east and into the west. And it's really a massive expansion. Again, if we quantify the genetic impact of those people onto Central Europe or onto Great Britain, we find more than 90% of the local population gets replaced by this new incoming population. So suddenly, basically, those people here and those people that were living here become genetically very, very similar, right? So it's a massive migration, a big, big event. We can also quantify the genetic components in those populations with this analysis we call structure, where we go back in time. So this is about 3,500 years ago. This is about 7,000 years ago. And you go back in time and you look at the genetic components in the different European populations. So those are the three components: the hunter-gatherers, the early farmers, and the steppe people that come from the southern Russian steppes mostly, so north of the Caucasus. And if you quantify that, you can see that the first people that have farming have just the farming component. Through time, you can see that the forager component is actually increasing, right? So you have more and more forager component. And then, about 4,800 years ago, you have this big, big, massive shift, and you suddenly have this Yamnaya-type population popping up in Central Europe. They come first to Central Europe and Eastern Europe. They then even come to Great Britain, and they remove everybody, or almost everybody that was living there before. So it's a really big, big, big event. And this is also present in the modern European population. So if we look at different people that live in Europe today from different parts, you can see that the Sardinians here, they have almost no ancestry from the steppe, so only 1–2%. But for example, people that live in Norway, or Lithuania, or Estonia, Iceland, Scotland, Czech Republic, they have a very, very high amount. More than half of their genetic ancestry is coming from the Russian steppe, from about 4,800 years ago onwards. And for example, people that would live in Germany today or in France, they would have about kind of 30–40% or so of that ancestry. It's really, really a big event. And that's an event that is so big, and it was not even well known before we did the genetic study that this happened. Some people have speculated about it before in the past. So you might have heard about the story of the Aryans that came from the east or from the north into Central Europe. You might have also heard about the steppe hypothesis of Indo-European languages that came from the east towards the west. And that seems to be really a big event, and that is something that we can basically provide now data with, discrete data from the genetic analysis. So there's really this mass migration that happened 4,800 years ago and spread this type of genetic ancestry all over Western Eurasia. So in summary, what can we say? We have an early migration of people that happened about 8,000 years ago that came from Anatolia, from this region that we call the Fertile Crescent, where agriculture first emerged about 10,000 years ago, and then agriculture spreads into the heart of Europe, bringing agriculture here about 7,000 years ago with people. That's people coming. That's not just culture. Then between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, this type of ancestry and this type of agriculture also spreads over the Caucasus, probably from further east, from what we call the Iranian Neolithic, into also what's then modern-day Russia. And what happens during that time in Western Eurasia is that there is genetic admixture between the hunter-gatherers and the local farmers. So they kind of meet each other, have babies with each other, and basically a mixture population is formed. And then about 4,800 years ago, you have this big migration of people from this region here, north of the Caucasus, from cultures or people that are very closely related to this Yamnaya culture people. And then it spreads into the west as well as into the east, which is not shown here. And then it diffuses all over Europe in the next 1,000 years, also in this bell beaker culture and especially in this corded ware culture. We have also a lot of data now from those two cultures that really shows how slowly this steppe ancestry is moving all over Europe. What one can also say is that the ancestry that spreads here, so the DNA, mostly spreads with men. So there's a much stronger impact on the Y chromosome, so the DNA that gets passed on from the father to the sons, than what we see on the mitochondrial DNA, which is the DNA that gets passed on from the mother to the offspring. So this seems to be a male-driven migration. Probably they are more mobile. Maybe it has something to do with horses that have been domesticated at that time, even though there's not so much evidence that they were all horse riders, but it could be that many of them were actually riding. They also had wheels and wagons, which was a new invention at that time. So they were highly mobile pastoralist people that probably moved towards the west here. One of the big questions that we have is, why did this happen? Right? I mean, one possibility is those people were mobile. They had horses, they had wheels, there were wagons. They expanded fast. They had a new type of pastoralism. They could use the landscape better than the people before. So this is why they were spreading so much and so successful, and they removed everybody else. Maybe they had better weapons. Maybe they were taller people. There's lots of evidence that goes in this direction. But one other possibility came up only about 3 years ago, and that was maybe it had something to do with diseases, with pathogens that were spreading at that time. Because our colleagues from Copenhagen, they actually found in some human remains from the Altai region, Yersinia pestis, the causative agent of plague in those people. 5,000 years ago, so very early. So the same pathogens that have caused the Justinianic plague or the Black Death were already present in the population, in the human population 5,000 years ago. So it could be that this whole migration was only made possible because the population that was living in this region before collapsed because of a pandemic, right? So that the mass migration was caused by people because there was a large pandemic here that just killed a lot of people, so there was a lot of room for new people to move in. And we've also done our homework, and we have looked at many human remains, we looked at many human remains that we had in our lab. And in all those individuals, so from the Yamnaya culture, from Bronze Age cultures here, from corded ware culture in the Baltic states, we all found Yersinia pestis. So whole genomes that we could reconstruct. So those people died of plague, and we could then even make phylogeny, so we could relate them to each other. So this is basically the two samples that were found before by the team in Denmark, and those were the ones that we could add. And we can actually see that from about 5,000 years ago, plague is present in many places in Western Eurasia. What we then did is a phylogeny, so this is basically a family tree of plague, so how plague strains are related to each other. So if we look at the family tree of plague, we can see this is the Black Death, so this is medieval plague. This is most of the plague strains you would find today in this region, here in Kazakhstan or in China or in Eastern Europe, so in kind of Western Russia, if you want. So this is where you find plague today. That's the Justinianic plague from the past, which is extinct strain. And this goes all back, so this is all modern plague. And this is the ancient plague strains here. And those are now the ones that you find during the Bronze Age. Starting with the oldest one, second oldest one, third oldest one, fourth oldest one, fifth oldest one, sixth oldest one, seventh oldest one. And it's very interesting because they are like pearls on a line. Right? This one gives rise to this one, close relative gives rise to this one, 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 gives rise to this one. So they seem to evolve into each other. What you can also do is you can connect those dots. You can actually connect this one with the kind of next close relative, which is this one, and then this one with the next close relative of this one. You can connect this one with the next relative, which is this one, and then this one with the next relative, and so forth. And you get this pattern here. So where this one spreads here and spreads there, this one spreads there, and then those ones spread back to the Altai region. And if you look at this pattern, you think like, what is he talking about? Doesn't make any sense, right? Looks really weird, like this strain moves here and moves there, and then moves around and moves back here. But this is the same pattern I've just shown you what the human people do at that time, right? This is exactly this pattern. Yamnaya expands here, Yamnaya expands there, and then about 3,600 years ago, a population from Central Europe actually moves back, which then becomes Sintashta and Andronovo, and we see that also in the humans. So it seems that the plague at that time actually follows the people, right? So it follows the human migration, which is very unusual. So there seems to be plague following people, at least this type of plague that we had during that time. What's also interesting is that if you look at this late Stone Age plague, how we now call it, there's a big gap in the genome. In the DNA, there's something missing. And what is missing in this ancient plague here from the Bronze Age is not just any gene or any region, it's actually the genes that are necessary for plague to get transmitted by fleas, right? So plague usually gets transmitted by a flea, so it's from, for example, rodents that have fleas, and those fleas bite infected rodents. They take up the bacteria, and then if they bite you, they can infect you. But the ancient strains from the late Stone Age, they would not have survived within the flea, or they might have even killed the flea. So they were not adapted to be transmitted by fleas. So therefore, these strains here, we think, could not cause what we call bubonic plague. They could only cause what we call septicemic plague or pneumonic plague. So transmitting it from humans to humans, right? Which is a very different disease. So it's more like some sort of flu or like a cold, where you cough on somebody, where you have droplets that fly around, and you inhale them, and then you get plague in your lungs. It's a very different disease. But what we also have now is a genome, which again comes from the Samara region here, which is about 4,000 years old. If you put that into the family tree of plague, it actually falls here. It doesn't fall with the other Bronze Age strains, it actually falls here. And if you look at its genome, it actually has this region. So it's the two green ones here. It doesn't have the gap like the Stone Age strains, it actually has this genome. So that is actually a genome or a strain that is fully capable of bubonic plague. Right? So there's also other genes that it acquired here during this early evolution. So what we can say is that 4,000 years ago, we have a plague strain in this region that can definitely cause bubonic plague. What we can, of course, also do with this type of analysis is we can not just look at Europe, but we can also look at different parts of the world. And I don't have much time. I could speak another hour about this slide that I'm showing you here, and we don't have another hour. Maybe next time when I come, I will just talk about Asia, not about just Europe. But we can do the same type of analysis for Asia. So what you have here, all the gray dots, are 10,000 people from Eurasia. This is Europe. That is Asia, right? That also shows you how small Europe is. And we all know that if we look at the map, this is Europe and this is Asia, right? It's much, much bigger than Europe. And that is also represented in the DNA of the people, right? And there's many interesting stories here that I don't have really time to talk about. I just want to point out the cornerstones of the genetic ancestry you find in Asia. So up here, this is a population that we call Nganasan. Some people of you might have heard about them. They live actually in your country. And they live up here on the Taimyr Peninsula, so in the most northern part of Russia. They are building also the most northern part of the genetic diversity we find in Eurasia today. This is Chukchi, which is a population that is actually present here on Beringia. So again, very far up in the north. Those are individuals here from East Asia. Those are individuals here from Taiwan that build kind of the other cornerstone. So between here and there, basically you have this kind of big genetic difference. So between people from Taiwan or people then from Northern Asia, you would have a big genetic difference. And then here you have this cline that goes through all those modern populations. So each triangle here is a modern population, and those are populations like Mansi or Selkup or Ket, which are all populations that live in Siberia. See those, they come from this region here. And here, those are individuals that actually come from the very north of Scandinavia, which are called Sami, which is this kind of native population or hunter-gatherer population, still mostly hunter-gatherer population that lives here up in Scandinavia. And you can see there's a gradient between those people and basically northern Siberia. So this is kind of the genetic ancestry that this group here is spanning. This is the Neolithic people of early Europe. This is actually also a very interesting population here. It's a collaboration we did with Alexandra, for example, here, and other people from the Caucasus, where we had a project where we looked at the genetic ancestry of the first farmers that lived in the southern part of Russia, like the Maikop culture, for example, or then later on Katakom culture or Yamnaya culture. They're coming from this region here. And you can see they're genetically quite homogeneous. There's two groups. Those are the people from the steppe. Those are the people from the mountains. You can see they're genetically quite distinct. But they're still, compared to this whole genetic diversity we have present here, actually quite genetically closely related. And we see basically this is two different populations, and there's strong genetic continuity between earlier people and later people in the Caucasus region here. But again, I could probably talk about that for like an hour, but we don't really have the time yet. This is just to give you some orientation about the different names, so Naganasan, Chukchi, and so forth. And this is the Maikop people, this is the Yamnaya people, this is the Neolithic. It's also clear if you look at Yamnaya and if you look at Maikop, Maikop is not just the ancestors of Yamnaya. They're genetically actually quite distinct. This is also a big question that archaeologists had for a very long time. What we can also do, and it's the very end now, we can also look at selection of phenotypes through time. So when humans move into a new territory, they might want to genetically adapt to this region. For example, when Europeans started to move to Australia 200 years ago, they encountered a massive problem. Australia has much more sunshine than Great Britain, right? So they all have sunburns every day. They use a lot of sunscreen. 20% of the Australians today have skin cancer, right? So for them, it's really bad to live in Australia because it's too much sun. If we would give it 10,000 years, all Australians would become black, right? If there would be natural selection. Of course, today you can just use sunscreen, so it's not a problem. But in the past, you couldn't do that. And that has happened in many places in the world. So when people migrate somewhere, they have to adapt to the new environment. And this is reflected by changes in the frequency of certain genes. So for example, here we have genes that are related to some phenotypes, like eye color or skin color. There's, for example, a gene that maybe half of you carry that gives you light eyes. So if you don't have brown eyes, there's a very high probability you carry that gene. Actually, 2 copies of that gene, one from your mother and one from your father. And if you look at the frequency of this gene that gives blue eyes, we find that today, it's the red bar here, we find that today in about 70% of Central Europeans. If we go back in time to the early farmers, the first people that came from Anatolia brought farming, the frequency is only about 20%, right? So they had mostly brown eyes. If we then go further back in time to about 8,000 years ago, to the hunter-gatherers that lived in Europe before farming came, they have 100% frequency. So they all had blue eyes. So 10,000 years ago, all Europeans all had blue eyes. Brown eyes didn't exist. If we would go further back in time to Neanderthals or something like that, or Denisovans, they all have brown eyes. Blue eyes only appeared 20,000 years ago. Before 20,000 years ago, nobody has blue eyes. 10,000 years ago, everybody has blue eyes. I'm not sure why. There's no good explanation. Maybe it's attractive. We're not quite sure. Maybe it's just a mistake or an artifact. I'm not quite sure. Could be drift, what we call it, but we're not quite sure. It's quite different for skin color. So skin color is also something that is very special for people that live in Europe today. We have very light skin, right? So I have sequenced my genome. I know kind of what variants I have. And I have these 2 mutations that almost all Central Europeans have today. It's about 100% frequency that give us light skin color. If we move back in time, for example, for this mutation here in green, we can see that in the Bronze Age, those people were pretty much light skin color like we are today. If we move back to the Neolithic, however, this mutation is in low frequency. So they had a kind of more darker skin color than people today. So if we look at Neolithic early farmers, they had probably a skin color which is more similar to people that live in northern Africa today or in the Near East. But if we go further back in time, to 8,000 years ago, to the hunter-gatherers of Europe, before farming, the frequency of this one is 0, and this one we only found in one guy. So basically they were all dark. From what we can say today, all Europeans 10,000 years ago were black, right? We can't really say that they were lighter. It could be that they have variants that we don't know, but they don't have the 2 mutations that cause the light skin color in Europeans today. So what we have to say right now is that all Europeans look like this 10,000 years ago, right? Which is a phenotype that's very different to what a lot of people think. If you think about Paleolithic people that lived in a cave here, you might think about people that look like us, but no, they don't, right? They have a very different color. They're more like dark-skinned people. You can also look at other things like the ability to drink milk. Many of you can drink a liter of milk. I can drink a liter of milk. Maybe some of you can as well. Many people don't, right? There's something that's called lactose intolerance, where you can't drink a lot of milk. And that's a mutation that a lot of people have in Europe today. So this mutation here is in about 70% frequency in Central Europeans. So most people have that mutation. It's a mutation that allows you to drink milk. We are actually the mutants. I'm a mutant as well, because I can drink milk. Most people in the world can't, most mammals can't. But if you look back in time, even in the Bronze Age, almost nobody could. If you look back in the Neolithic or the farmers, the frequency is 0. The mutation doesn't exist. So this mutation was spreading in the last 2,000–3,000 years. We're not even sure when it spread. In the medieval time, it's the same frequency like today. In the Iron Age, it seems to rise. In the Bronze Age, it's low frequency. It seems to be the Iron Age, like the Celtics or other populations, where it was spreading. We're not quite sure why. Probably they just had more cows. They had a lot of milk. They also have cows that produce more milk. A cow today produces 50 liters of milk a day. A cow in the Neolithic, 2 liters, right? That's a big shift also. So if you have more milk, you can, of course, also drink more. OK, sorry, I had one more story. It's actually a story. I told the same story 2 years ago when I was here in the same lecture hall. This story got online, and it caused 3,000 comments on one blog post where basically people had discussed that. So it seems to be very interesting to people, so I thought I'd bring it up again. This is the story about languages, right? I mentioned it before, Indo-European languages. We speak Indo-European languages. You speak Russian, I speak English and German. But it's a language group which is the biggest one in the world today. It's spoken by 3 billion people or so. So it's very, very common in the world today. But the origin has been debated a lot. And there's 2 theories. One theory is that the language comes from the Yamnaya and from the steppe. And the other theory is that the language came from Anatolia, which might be hard to see here, from Anatolia with the early farmers. And what I showed you today is that there were people coming with farming, and that there were people coming from the steppe. So based on the genetic data, both hypotheses are possible, right? Nothing speaks against the first people bringing it or the second big kind of migration from Russia bringing it, right? So this both is possible. But in the genetic data, we can distinguish about what type of ancestry is spreading. And what we actually find is that the Anatolian early farming ancestry, we, for example, would not find, this is hard to see, here should be Europe, and this is India or something like that. So here should be India. India doesn't have this early farmer ancestry. So basically, India, where they also speak Indo-European languages, does not receive DNA from this region. India only receives DNA from this region here, but not from this region. So not from Anatolia. So then it would have been spreading without people. It would have just spread culturally, which it can. Languages can spread culturally, but it's more unlikely. So if we bring together the genetic data that we currently have with the kind of language distribution, how we find languages in the world today, and also the age of the languages, we come up with a model that is a bit different to this model, and it's a bit different to that model. Because there's some problems that with this hypothesis we cannot explain, and with this hypothesis we cannot explain, and therefore we developed a new hypothesis that we call the hybrid hypothesis. And what the hybrid hypothesis basically is telling us is that the origin of the Indo-European languages is not in Anatolia, and it's not in the steppe, but it's actually in this region here south of the Caucasus. Because there's a type of ancestry that is sitting in this region here about 8,000 years ago, which we call Iranian Neolithic. And the Iranian Neolithic, which is part of the Fertile Crescent, is genetically different from Anatolia and the Levant, but it's present in all populations that speak Indo-European languages today, whereas this ancestry of the early farmers is not. And also this hunter-gatherer ancestry here of Eastern Europe, which is present in the Yamnaya to 50%, is also not present in all other populations. So the only genetic component that we really find in all populations that speak Indo-European today is this component here that sits south of the Caucasus, probably spreading about 7,000 years ago into the steppe, giving rise to Mycop and later populations that are probably Indo-European speakers that bring the Indo-European languages to Europe. It also is present, of course, in Armenian, and also Anatolian, so Hittite, for example. And it spreads also probably in this direction here into India, maybe also around the Caspian Sea in this direction or that direction. That's not really clear. And this also fits very well with the data that we get from linguistic trees, where we date the common ancestor of all Indo-European languages to about 8,000 years ago. This is when this genetic component is sitting here. So again, I could probably talk another hour about this. I don't have time for that, but I just wanted to bring it up because last time it caused a lot of discussion, and I just wanted to clarify it a bit. So then what can we say? At least for the Neolithic revolution and for many other such phenomena, it's a movement of people, something that we now know based on the genetic data. But it's not just people that bring their culture, it's also they bring genes, they bring new adaptations to new environments that I hopefully could show you. But they also bring diseases, right? The plague was also disseminated by those people, and they also spread those diseases in large parts of Eurasia. So by that, I would like to thank a lot of people. This was the first study that I showed you from 2014, where we worked together with David Reich and his team, and also people from the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. That was the second study I presented, which was coordinated by Wolfgang Haag and colleagues, who was still in Australia then, who's with us now, and also David Reich. The third study that I talked about, which was also with David Reich, where we looked at the phenotypes through time. The fourth study that I presented to you, which is coordinated by Wolfgang Haag and Chanchao Wang from our institute, which is submitted right now, hopefully will be published soon. So this was the PCA from Eurasia, and Mycop is also a collaboration with Natalia here and also with Alexandra. And then the fifth and the sixth study I talked about, again, with many people. So this was about plague with Ida here and Alexander, as well as here with Resida and Maria. And yeah, that's my team. It's quite international, more than 20 nationalities, lots of funding bodies that basically finance the work that we do. And thank you for your attention.